The Black Death was more than a disease. It was terror, chaos, and the collapse of a world. When it struck Europe in the 14th century, it left behind not just corpses, but an entirely different society. Nearly a third of the continent's population vanished in just a few years. Cities fell silent, villages were abandoned, and faith in the church, in rulers, and in life itself shattered. This is the story of how the plague swept across Europe and how it changed everything. At the dawn of the 1300s, Europe looked as though it was climbing into greatness. Cathedrals soared over bustling towns, markets bustled with merchants selling cloth, spices, and grain, and kings battled to extend their borders. The old feudal order was still alive, peasants tied to their lords' fields, knights riding under banners, but cracks were already forming. A series of failed harvests and famines had left people weak and desperate. The population had grown larger than the land could comfortably feed. Beneath the surface of all the progress people had made, there were still weak points in their health and society, and it was into these weaknesses that the plague would strike, spreading quickly and causing devastation. The origins of the Black Death lie not in Europe, but far to the east. In the endless steppes of Central Asia, the bacterium Yersinia pestis thrived in wild rodents. Fleas fed on these animals, carrying the deadly germ inside them. In their tiny stomachs, the bacteria multiplied until they blocked the flea's gut. Starving, the flea tried to feed again, regurgitating the infection directly into the bloodstream of its victim. The plague had been around for centuries, flaring up in small outbreaks and then disappearing. But by the 14th century, trade had tied distant regions together more tightly than ever. Caravans and merchant ships connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Alongside silk and spices, the invisible plague traveled. It rode in the fur of rats that infested cargo holds and in the blood of merchants themselves. By the 1340s, it had reached the great Mongol armies, sweeping through Asia and into Eastern Europe. Chroniclers later told the story of a Mongol army besieging the Crimean port city of Kaffa. As their soldiers began dying of plague, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. Terrified traders fled the city on ships bound for Italy, unknowingly carrying death with them. By late 1347, those ships docked in Genoa, Venice, and Pisa. When they unloaded their goods, rats and fleas scattered, and the plague broke loose in Europe. What began as a whisper became a roar. Within weeks, entire families were struck down. By the following year, the disease spread through France, Spain, and England. By 1350, it had reached Germany and Scandinavia. There was no stopping it. The plague revealed itself with brutal clarity. Victims developed fever, chills, and agonizing headaches. Within days, swellings appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck, dark, swollen lumps called buboes. These gave the disease its name, the bubonic plague. The swellings were filled with pus and blood, so painful that sufferers writhed and screamed. Black blotches spread across the skin as blood vessels collapsed. Within 3 to 5 days, most victims were dead. For some, the disease took another form. If the bacteria spread into the lungs, it became pneumonic plague, spread by coughing and breathing. Pneumonic plague killed in 2 days or less, leaving no time for help. In its septicemic form, it flooded the bloodstream, killing almost instantly. Medieval people had no way of knowing these differences, only that death came fast, unpredictable, and unstoppable. The terror of the plague was amplified by helplessness. Doctors of the 14th century had no understanding of germs. They explained disease through imbalanced humors, poisoned air, or God's punishment for sin. Some believed the alignment of the planets had unleashed the horror. Physicians wore long robes, gloves, and strange bird-beaked masks filled with herbs and spices, hoping to filter the miasma of death. They bled patients, lanced buboes, burned incense, or forced victims to drink potions of mercury or crushed emeralds. None of it worked. Ordinary people tried whatever they could. Fires were lit in the streets to cleanse the air. Vinegar was sprinkled on doorways. Cats and dogs were slaughtered in towns, accused of carrying the disease, though ironically, killing them only gave the rat population more freedom to spread. But every effort failed. The plague rolled over Europe like an unstoppable storm. The social order broke apart under pressure. Families abandoned their own members to die alone, terrified of catching the sickness. Priests refused to administer last rites. Neighbors turned on one another. In some cities, carts rolled through the streets with the cry of, "Bring out your dead," collecting corpses for mass burial pits. In London, Paris, and Florence, the smell of death became the air itself. In some places, corpses lay unburied, rotting where they fell. Faith, once the anchor of European life, crumbled. The Church could not explain or stop the plague, and its authority weakened. Some claimed the plague was God's punishment for sin, and waves of panic swept across towns. Others looked for scapegoats. Across Europe, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and violent pogroms erupted. Whole Jewish communities were wiped out, burned alive, or driven from their homes. Hatred became another symptom of the disease. Meanwhile, the flagellants emerged. These were groups of men who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public processions to atone for humanity's sins. People watched in awe and terror, believing such suffering might appease God and stop the plague. But nothing stopped it. The plague was deaf to prayers and penance. The statistics of death are almost too vast to imagine. Europe's population at the start of the century was around 75 million. Within only a few years, somewhere between 25 and 30 million were gone. In some regions, entire villages disappeared from the map. In Florence, chroniclers wrote that over half the people perished. In England, the population dropped by nearly 40%. Survivors found themselves walking through fields with no farmers, towns with no shopkeepers, streets with no sound but the wind. The plague did not just kill people, it killed the systems they lived under. With so many peasants dead, fields went untilled, harvests rotted, and food grew scarce. Labor became precious and wages rose. Serfs began demanding more freedom, and feudal lords discovered they could no longer control them as before. Some survivors inherited vast lands or fortunes simply because their relatives were gone, while others fell into deeper misery as famine and inflation followed. Culture changed as well. Art turned darker. Painters filled their works with skeletons, rotting corpses, and the image of the dance of death where kings, peasants, and bishops all danced hand in hand with death himself. Literature, too, reflected the shadow. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron told of 10 young Florentines fleeing the plague into the countryside, telling stories to distract themselves while their city died. Music carried the same echoes, chants, and hymns tinged with despair. Death became the center of the medieval imagination, and the plague did not simply vanish. It returned again and again in waves across the next centuries. Every generation after 1347 lived with the fear that the Black Death would come again, and often it did. Towns rebuilt only to be emptied once more. Europe's population would not fully recover until well into the 1500s, nearly 200 years later. Yet in strange ways, the plague reshaped Europe for the future. The collapse of feudal order opened the door to social mobility. Laborers could negotiate better conditions, and the rigid old structures began to weaken. The disaster forced doctors to change how they worked, moving them slowly toward watching and studying patients, instead of just following old books. With faith in the Church shaken, people began to look for answers elsewhere, laying the groundwork for the intellectual and artistic explosion of the Renaissance. The Black Death was the great equalizer. Kings died as easily as peasants. Bishops fell beside beggars. It was a reminder of human fragility before forces of nature. When the plague swept across Europe, it did not just kill bodies, it killed the old world. And out of the ashes, a new Europe slowly rose, scarred, transformed, and haunted forever by the memory of death. The Black Death was more than a tragedy. It was the nightmare that defined an age. But history has even more fascinating leaders waiting in the shadows. Stick around and subscribe. Let's explore their worlds together. History isn't just old stories. It's an epic adventure full of power, ambition, and incredible tales. Thank you for watching.